Hello and welcome to this Tungsten Replicator masterclass where we start looking at working with our heterogeneous targets, specifically Postgres and Oracle. My name is Chris Parker, VP of Customer Success here at Continuant. So in this short course, we'll quickly review the Replicator Flow, and then we'll look at the Oracle and Postgres specific prerequisites required to set up replication between MySQL and one of these targets. We'll look at the configurations, and then I will do a demonstration of setting up a replication pipeline between MySQL and Postgres. So a quick recap on Replicator Flow. The replicator itself, two installations. We have what we call the source replicator or the extractor, and that is installed locally alongside MySQL database. If you're extracting from a cloud source, it would be on its own host in what we call an offboard installation or an offboard extractor. But ultimately the extractor, the replicator process, once it's running, it mines the MySQL binary logs as they are generated by MySQL, and we extract that information and put it into our own native format called THL or transaction history log. That information is then stored locally on disk and then picked up by the applier. There could be one or more appliers depending upon the topology you are installing, but those THL files are picked up, processed, and then applied to your target database. In the case of Oracle, Postgres, and also MySQL, we apply that directly using the JDBC protocols. So how does this look in terms of configuration? Well, first of all, prerequisites. Your replicator hosts have a bunch of prerequisites which are outlined on our documentation pages. There is a prerequisite checklist on there which is quite useful, but it outlines all of the minimum versions of things like Ruby and Java that you need, and it also outlines best practices for an operating system user, configuring your etc host file, configuring your network, making sure that the extractor and applier replicator hosts have the relevant network connectivity between each other and also between the extractor and the source database and the applier and the target database. For MySQL, there are some recommendations of my.cnf properties and various user accounts that you need to set up ready to extract. For Oracle and Postgres, all of the same prerequisites apply for the applier host. Additionally, within your Oracle and Postgres databases, there'll be some user accounts needed. You will need to pre-create the schemas and the objects. Now, we have a tool called DDLScan, which will do this for you. However, just a point of note here is the replicator for heterogeneous replication. So MySQL to Oracle, MySQL to Postgres, we only replicate DML. We don't replicate DDL. So any table changes that occur, they won't get replicated. So that's something that you need to handle. When you start the installation, you need to have all your objects created. Start replication, everything's working great. If you create a new table or make any changes, you will then need to create those in the target. I'll go through that a little bit in the demonstration and show you as well. For Oracle, you will need to get the relevant JDBC libraries from wherever you get your Oracle software from that you're licensed to use, and they will need to be placed on the applier host. And depending upon what your configuration is, if you're setting up an offboard applier, you may need to install the various client utilities so that you can access the database. But they're optional depending upon how you've configured it. In terms of the object mapping in Oracle, for your MySQL database would map to an Oracle user or an Oracle schema. So if you have a MySQL database called demo, you would need to have an Oracle user called demo. For Postgres, your MySQL instance itself maps to a Postgres database, and then your MySQL database maps to a Postgres schema. So that's how the difference maps, and that's what you would need to get ready. As I mentioned, we have this tool called DDLScan. This is there for reverse engineering your table structure. So as I mentioned, we don't replicate DDL, but to help you out, we do have this tool which will give you the reverse engineer of your MySQL objects. It will create the DDL specific for your target by using these templates. It can be used for single objects or entire databases. As I say, this must be configured prior to starting the replicator. So there are two examples here of using DDLScan, one for Oracle, one for Postgres. And in this example, this DDLScan command has been executed on the extractor host where Tungsten's already been installed. So it's using the Tungsten service alpha to get the credentials and the details for the source. It's using the DDL MySQL Oracle or DDL MySQL Postgres template, and it's going to reverse engineer the entire test database and put that into a file called ddl.sql. I'll show you in our demonstration how you can run this prior to installing Tungsten as well. Your typical extractor config will be the same as all extractors that we've talked about in our other training sessions so far. The prime differences for heterogeneous replication I've outlined here in bold. You would need to include the enable heterogeneous service equals true flag. This tells Tungsten Replicator that you're extracting and intending to apply to a non-MySQL instance. It's also recommended that you use the replicate filter either to ignore the MySQL database or to selectively say which schemas or objects that you want to replicate. Obviously, if you're going MySQL to Oracle or MySQL to Postgres, replicating the MySQL database may cause problems. So I recommend that you set the replicate filter up and only replicate the objects that you need to replicate and use that DDLScan tool to pre-create those objects. In terms of the applier, the Postgres and Oracle applier, there's some examples here. The main difference is on the service level. So the defaults are pretty much the same, but at the service level, you have the data source type. So Postgres, and then you have the replication port 5432, which is the default Postgres port. And then you have the DB name that you're replicating into. For Oracle, data source type is Oracle, the port 1521, which is your default port. The data source Oracle service name, ORCL, that's just your default Oracle service name. And then you also need this case transform filter. So in Oracle, all objects, it's case sensitive and everything is in uppercase. So what we do is we transform schema names, object names, we transform it all to uppercase by default to write into Oracle, otherwise it will fail. So just use this case transform filter to do that for you. The replication user in Oracle, if you remember from previous sessions, we have this tracking schema. So when you start the replicator up, you have a tungsten underscore service name tracking schema. So in this example here, it would be tungsten underscore alpha. With Oracle, the schema is actually a user. So you need to create your user in this format, tungsten underscore, and then the service name. So that's important that matches what the tracking schema would be called in your source database. The final thing to point out here is with heterogeneous replication, your source MySQL database must be in row-based binary logging. We can only do heterogeneous replication if you have row-based binary logging enabled. So let's do a demonstration. Switch screens, get a Postgres replicator running. So over here, I have my extractor on the left-hand side, and I have my applier on the right-hand side. So I've already installed Postgres. That is already up and running. And if I just connect to Postgres now right here, okay, the demo database is there, the username is there, but there's nothing, I haven't created any schema or anything yet. On the left-hand side is my MySQL database. And if I just go into here, I do have a HR schema in here. If I can type correctly, there we go. So I have a HR schema. And in that schema, I have a few tables, but all these tables are empty. I haven't got any data in them yet, but I've got the structure there. So first of all, what I need to do is I need to create my structure in my target database, okay? Because as I said, we don't replicate DDL changes, we only replicate DML changes. So the first thing I need to do is use this DDLScan tool. So DDLScan can be used when Tungsten's been installed, or it can be used from the software staging directory before we install. So I'll show you both ways of doing this. First of all, opt continuance software and go into the staging directory for the replicator that you are installing. And in there is a Tungsten Replicator directory and bin. And in there we have the DDLScan tool. What we can do is we can call DDLScan and pass it a JDBC URL for the database connection. So I'm just going to copy and paste that in there. So we're calling DDLScan, the username and the password, the URL, and then the JDBC URL to make a connection to our source database. We're telling it to use the DDL MySQL Postgres template and to reverse engineer the HR database. So if we just run that, and that will give us some SQL here. Okay, we create the schema HR, and then we create all of the tables. I'm just going to copy this directly from here and paste that into Postgres over here. Obviously, if you have a very large schema, hundreds of tables, this isn't necessarily practical, but what you can do is run that DDLScan command, output it to a file, ddl.sql, and then you can just copy that SQL file across and import that into Postgres as well. So that's got our schema in sync. The objects are there. We're ready to go. So what we can do first of all is let's install, make sure I'm in the right directory. Yep. So let's install the extractor. So tools, tpm install. And then what we'll do over here is I will, come out of there, opt continuant software, replicator 01, tools, tpm install on the applier. Whilst that's running, I will just refresh your memory as to what we have in the configuration file. So we have the default section, which is pretty standard. And then we have the service section. So we have the enable heterogeneous service is true, which is our key property that tells the replicator that we are replicating into a non-MySQL instance. We have the filters. So we have the replicate filter that I'm applying, and I only want to replicate the HR schema. And we also have the drop statement data filter in. We need this in place because if we left that out and we made some DDL changes, it would break replication because we wouldn't be able to apply MySQL DDL into Postgres. The replicator doesn't do that in-flight translation of DDL. So yeah, apply that drop statement data filter to get rid of that. So that installation is finished. Reload the environment and we can start the replicator. On the applier, same config here, pretty basic. We have the Postgres database we're going into, the database port, the data source type. Everything else is kind of the standard configuration type properties. So that's installed, reload the environment, and we will start the replicator. So if we look over here, tripctl status, we can see the extractor is running and ready to go. Tripctl status over here. The applier is running and ready to go. So let's make some data changes. Let's see this flow through. So let's log into MySQL. Let's go to the HR directory, and just to show we have nothing in the countries table. And over here, PSQL, let's log in, and I will show you that we have nothing in the countries table here. It's empty. So let's just insert some data. I'm just going to insert a couple of rows in here. Just copy some DML that I have pre-prepared, paste that in there. Okay, select star from countries now. Oops, if I can spell it correctly. There we go. We can see we have 5 rows. Over here now, execute the same statement, and we have 5 rows. This is great. So this shows that the replication is going. We now have MySQL to Postgres replicating in real time. So what about DDL changes? So we've added that drop statement data filter. So the replicator is just going to ignore DDL, but how do we actually handle that? Well, let's take an example here. I'm going to create a new table in my database over here, and I'm going to put some data in that table because I've just added a new table to my application. I want to preload it. There we go. So great, MySQL, I've got my select star from regions. That's there, brilliant. But what's happened over here? Well, first of all, the create table statement will have been completely ignored. And the replicator is now in an error state because we're trying to do an insert into a table that doesn't exist. So this is pretty standard. This is what would happen. So what we now need to do is we need to create that table manually. Now, if you want to craft the DDL yourself, you can do that as long as the column names match. Then you can create that table ahead of it. You could have created it in Postgres first, then created it in MySQL, then added the data, and everything will be great. Or you can make use of the DDLScan tool. So if it's a table with lots and lots of columns and you don't necessarily know what the data type mappings are for each of your columns, let DDLScan do that for you. So we're going to do that now. The previous DDLScan where we ran it from the staging directory and specified the JDBC URL, because the replicator is already installed, we can use the installed version of DDLScan, and we can just tell it to pick up the connection information from the installed service, so the service alpha. So that will get the password, the host name, the port, and all that stuff. And we're also then saying tables regions. I only want to reverse engineer that one table because that's the only table I've changed. So there we go, we get the create table for that. So I'm just going to copy that create table only. I'm going to come over to my Postgres instance. And I'm going to create that table. And then I'm going to bring my replicator back online. We now look at trepctl status. It's no longer in an error state. It's retried those transactions. The table exists now, so we can now actually apply that data. And if I go in and I select star from hr.regions, we can see that data is replicated. So that's how you would handle those DDL changes. Okay, so that's the end of the demo. So I'll now switch back to my slides. So in summary, what have we learned today? Well, we reviewed the Replicator Flow for replicating from MySQL into Postgres and also into Oracle. We looked at the Oracle and the Postgres specific prerequisites, so creating those usernames. We talked about DDLScan, making sure your schema structure is there beforehand. We looked at the configuration differences between the two, and then finally did a demonstration of setting up the replication flow from MySQL to Postgres. So thank you for listening. Thank you for your time. I hope you found this useful, and I look forward to seeing you on another training course in the future. Take care, thank you, and goodbye.